Good morning. Thank you for everyone for joining us on our first ever LinkedIn Live official one. I am Margaret Shear, Head of Marketing here at MIRACL, and we're joined this morning with Michael Tanaka, our Chief Commercial Officer. Michael, good morning.
Hi there, Margaret. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. So the reason that we're kicking off this LinkedIn Live series is in honor of, or support of, I should say, Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Every October, we all talk about what's most important in the sector, and one of the key points this particular month is about enabling MFA. MFA, for those who don't know, stands for multi-factor authentication, and I think most users would be familiar with it for those super annoying SMS text messages you get, or magic links or other kind of ways that get in the way of your login process, but is actually making you more secure and your accounts more secure. However, one of the things that we kind of come across is in any kind of tech adoption, but especially with enabling MFA, there seems to be some really common barriers. So we wanted to spend some time to walk through what are the perceptions or perceived barriers that people and companies have to adopting MFA. And as we go along, if there's any questions, please put them in the comments below and we will get to those at the end. So Michael, can you tell us a bit about, what are the most common drivers to adopt MFA other than, it just makes good sense?
Yeah, I would definitely say it splits into a two-part answer there. The first one would obviously focus on the enterprise, where adoption is actually much higher. Depending upon who you're speaking to, it could be anywhere from 50 to 70% or sometimes even more. And there you've got some clear drivers. As an example, one of which is the need to get cyber risk insurance, which obviously, given all the ransomware attacks and other things these days, is actually extremely important. The problem there is that most of the underwriters won't actually touch you unless you actually are using multi-factor across all of your points of entry, as well as most of the entries into the underlying services that your staff use. And if you don't have that, then you're either going to be uninsurable or you're going to have to pay premiums, which just are unaffordable. So the net result is adoption in the enterprise is actually speeding up, if anything. And of course, there's also been the background. The enterprise has always been a little bit more security conscious. They have more control over their staff. So of course, the policies and the people in charge of the security can actually deploy and ensure that there's some adoption. Of course, that's completely different for the consumer side. And if you look at the consumer side, you'll see adoption is somewhere around the 5% range. In fact, if you actually looked at some of the stats that came out of Twitter, it was around 2.4%, and Facebook was around 4% last year. There, the actual drivers are only now starting to appear. I mean, if you look at something like PSD2 in Europe, that's Payment Service Directive Revision 2, which mandates strong customer authentication, aka multi-factor authentication, for a lot of transactions over a certain level of risk. That's been in place for a good few years, and obviously financial institutions and services have had to adopt multi-factor by a regulated sort of mandate. Recently, we've seen something more in a sort of broader consumer sphere, and that is in the U.S., the New Jersey Department of Gaming Enforcement, as of the 1st of June, mandated that all people had to authenticate using multi-factor within 30 days. So all the companies around there, the actual operators, had to scramble and basically take what was a poorly adopted multi-factor option and turn that into the default login process. They had 30 days to do that, which you can imagine wasn't ideal for them.
So a lot of the companies are really feeling driven by the stress of compliance or insurance or the security, and then all of a sudden these timelines come across. So they need something that can be turned on rather quickly, but then you'd also hope it has a good user experience for, their end clients and end users. So it's interesting. So what do you feel like are, so if you have this kind of earnestness to be compliant, to get your insurance, to create a better user experience or keep your users safe from hacking, what are kind of some of the different hurdles that you then need to come across? I think we often encounter complexity in our work days, especially when it comes to any kind of adoption of tech. We know that in primarily most digital transformation projects fail within the enterprise because the tech is either too complex or the communications around the adoption don't foster the change that you want all of the users to be taking. Can you tell us why there's a perception of why people might feel that traditional MFA is too complex?
Well, if you think about those stats about the Twitter and the Facebook, consider the fact that both Twitter and Facebook have offered multi-factor for years. They've actively promoted it. They've talked about the virtues of it, the security, and so on. And of course, the users themselves have not adopted it. And in fact, if you go to the gaming companies that I mentioned before, New Jersey, I think the sort of averages were, again, around 2 to 5% adoption of multi-factor. And we actually got to three things. It's not just complexity, it's also compatibility with the user systems, but also the being able to actually deploy these sort of solutions as well. So from the operators, the services themselves, and also costs as well. So you could call it complexity, compatibility, and cost if you'd like. Looking at the complexity part, because of course that affects the user more so, and actually you can think of it in terms of the usability or the user experience. Most multi-factor solutions, of which, to be honest, they aren't actually multi-factor, they're multi-step. Something like, as an example, credentials. When we talk about credentials, what we mean is usernames and passwords, coupled with a second step, something like an SMS, one-time passcode, or an email magic link. They make up about 60 to 70% of the so-called multi-factor solutions out there. If you think about that process, it involves a good half a dozen steps and multiple different systems, because you're not only reliant on, let's say, the internet where you're receiving your cloud-based service, you're now reliant on the cellular network. You're reliant on things like your mobile phone being operable. You're being present, having battery, not getting distracted when you turn it on, and so on and so forth. So all these additional half dozen steps or so introduce all sorts of complexity for the user, and they are essentially just challenges. Even the act of transferring the OTP from one device to another is where you're going to start losing your users.
And you talked a bit about the complexity also, I guess, in terms of compatibility for ability to integrate some sort of aspect into, a client's current stack and tech stack. Can you tell us a couple of anecdotes that you've heard as far as, you deal with different clients every single day that are talking about their MFA adoption journey? What are their concerns about compatibility or how to integrate the tech into their current stacks?
Well, if you think about it from a sort of top-down perspective, if I design some sort of login process, and then I can promise to my board that I'm going to be able to capture 90% of my users, my first question is going to be, the board should be asking, what about the other 10%? And say, oh, well, don't worry about that. Well, we can stick with some SMS OTPs for those. Okay, that captures another 8% of them. What about the last 2%? Oh, well, let's do a third thing or a fourth thing or whatever. So what you have is all these sort of different edge cases. The issues with that is that most of these edge cases, it's not like if it's a 2% edge case, it's going to cost you 2% to deploy. In actual fact, it's going to be much the same sort of cost and expense and management overhead as the 90% is going to be, because you still have to train all your support staff, and you still have to train your users. You still have to actually have the systems in place, whether you're authenticating 1,000 people or 1 million people. Additionally, what you're doing is you're adding complexity to the user interface itself. As much as I think consumers want options, often if you present too many options, it confuses them. And of course, what you're going to have is either those users are going to be bouncing, or they're going to be hitting your support. Or if they do manage to make their way in, they're going to be a little bit upset and far less likely to engage with your service in the way you want.
Okay. And so as far as, so we've touched about the cost the greater cost of it. You also talked about the traditional multi-step, multi-factor authentication is requiring different kinds of tech enablement and those kind of costs. And you touched briefly about, I'd like you to just kind of elaborate more on what I'd call the ripple effect of costs. By picking a better MFA solution, what are there opportunities to save that you don't necessarily consider that, in this adoption, it's not just about, cost per authentication, but where could other savings or other opportunities for same costs happen?
Yeah, well, I think what you want to do is then think about the total cost of ownership, and we often think about those in those terms for systems. If you want to sort of segment your login process and say that's a sort of single sort of process, then you can definitely start looking at the costs associated to that. So you've got the obvious indirect costs, things like any license fees that you might have, or some the transport layer, like the example being SMS costs and things like that. And those are the really obvious costs. But what you have to think about in terms of the real cost, the real impact on your enterprise or your service, are things like support. I mean, if you actually look at the stats there, again, it's really variable depending upon what industry and what circumstances. But you'll typically see that anywhere between 20 and 70% of all support desk queries are to do with things like authentication issues, which means that given you have somewhere in the order of, I've heard as low as say $5 per ticket, but also as high as $100 per ticket. It can be really, really expensive if what happens is you start actually seeing all these additional sort of support queries coming in. So going back to, as an example, the New Jersey Department of Gaming Enforcement, when they mandated multi-factor to be deployed by default, what we saw is that on average, the operators lost anywhere from 10% or more of their total traffic. But on top of that, they also saw a massive increase in their support costs. Because if you think about it, that 2 to 4% of users who were using SMS OTPs and actually generate a high proportion of support tickets have now become 90% or more of your users. And you can imagine those support costs have just gone through the roof. Then there's also another one, which isn't obviously a direct cost, but it's definitely a cost to the business. Because of course, you are looking at potentially 10% or more loss in actual top line engagement or numbers of people you're actually authenticating in. But then there's also the people that do manage to get in. If, as an example, just we can always personalize this because we've all been through the same sort of situation. How many times you've gone to a service, they've said, "Oh, we're sending an SMS text, the phone ending in 6141." And you're thinking, "Oh, bugger, I don't have that phone on me," or whatever. So you search, you scramble it, you find it. By that time, of course, the text is already gone, expired. You ask another one. Oh, that one's delayed. You spam the button. You have 4 more. They all come in different sort of orders. And I sort of liken that to the idea of waiting for a bus. It's late, and then suddenly all of them arrive at the same time, and they're all mixed up. The end result is that you then have to reset your system or re-enroll for the whole process and so on. So 15 minutes later, you finally manage to get in. And of course, you're then displayed some sort of splash screen that you've got the latest offer. Why don't you take us up? You're a free user. Let's take up the subscription because it's so exciting. And so, there's so many advantages to it. But you're just thinking about the experience you had. And you're just thinking how pissed off you are. And you're thinking, now I've just wasted 15 minutes. And actually, I've managed to get in. Great. I'll come back to it when I'm in a better state of mind, but I'm leaving now. So you've just lost that as a revenue stream.
Yes, it's a cost of frustration that's sometimes quantifiable, but the feeling is residual when the clients come back for other interactions in the future, or if you've just lost them just based on that frustration that you've given them. Well, so I appreciate what we've done so far. As I mentioned before, if anyone has any questions or any comments as far as kind of these 3 C's that maybe you've come across in your own adoption or reasons of why you're not yet adopting multi-factor authentication, please do put them in the comments below. Obviously, we've talked about these complexity, compatibility, and cost in a perceived view of multi-step, multi-factor authentication. But we believe at MIRACL that our solution, our single-step MFA, overcomes this. these three and quite simply. And so, Michael, I'm curious if you can show us a quick demo of how our tech works.
Of course. Actually, this is the fun bit. So let's see. And apologies for the blatant plug here, but MIRACL's multi-factor authentication is actually the world's fastest authentication, bar none, and it also has the highest success rates in the world. So our users typically will authenticate in 2 to 3 seconds, and we have in some instances success rates as high as 99.996%, i.e. one failure in every 25,000 authentication attempts. And the nice part about it is because it's being deployed via your browser and it's actually rendered in the browser, it means it has exactly the same sort of characteristics in regards to scalability and compatibility as a username and password field, i.e. you can deploy it anywhere. So if your users have access to your cloud service, they should be able to authenticate with MIRACL's multi-factor. And here, I'll give you a quick example. This is just obviously a demo site, but the idea is quite close. And that is you hit login, you're presented with a PIN pad, you type in your PIN, and that's it. And just very briefly, the reason why that's so secure is because what we're doing is we are allowing the user to choose a PIN for the device, meaning both the device has to be present and the user has to know what the PIN is. So this means any sort of form of remote attack just won't work because generally speaking, the attacker won't have access to the user's device.
Michael, do you mind showing us one more time? There's something funny with the screenshots or the screen sharing.
All right, yeah. Hit login, PIN pad, type in the PIN, and we're done. And you can see, excuse me, extremely low friction. And the idea here is we're already in a logged in session. There's a lot of issues with just assuming a logged in session is secure, session hijacking, or maybe the user's just left the desktop. And so the idea here is that we can also re-authenticate the user's actions. In this case, it's a transaction, but it could be just about any action. And again, it happens within the same page. And that second sort of step, sort of re-authentication, has nearly 100% success rate because you're using exactly the same PIN that the user used to log into the service in the first place. And in addition to doing the re-authentication, we also created a digital signature to create an immutable, irrefutable proof of the action of this identity on this device against these transaction details.
Well, just to prove our point about compatibility, it seems that there's some screen sharing issues, so I can't see that on mine. There we are. Do you want to do one more? Yeah, so if you
what you mean, okay, so you want to do is log in again. Okay, so here we go, login, right? Here we go, as authenticating a transaction, all right, or an action, you might say. And you can see I can whip through those really easily, and that's where we're getting those 99.996% level sort of authentication success rates.
And when we talk about login success rate, there's certain situations where that's just you're able to get in, your PIN in the first try, and that's something that you selected. We know that I think about times like how many times have I reset a password just today? And that's a failure if you have to reset this. So this is 99.996, right? Is extraordinary, and it saves everyone time. And then you just get on with what you're doing, which looks like at the moment sending the demo some money. So that sounds nice. So if there's any questions from the viewing audience, please let us know now. But otherwise, please do get in touch at miracle.com. Here on LinkedIn, if you'd like to talk about some of the barriers that your company has been having to your own adoption, get in touch because we think we can sort it. We know we can sort it.
What, with the login you love?
With the login you love, yes. All right. It doesn't look like there's any questions, but Michael, thank you very much for taking the time this morning, walking us through those different perceived barriers and then showing us this demo. And I'm sure this will be the beginning of many other videos that I'll force you to do.
Okay. Well, enjoy it in any case.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.